Within historical game studies, the most influential system of categorization is beyond doubt that offered by Chapman in 2016. Chapman proposes a dichotomy between realist simulations such as Call of Duty, which present their history through their audio-visual world and tend to present very linear stories, and conceptual simulations like Civilization, which present history through their mechanics and procedural rhetoric, and are much more open-ended and abstract. Chapman's model is simple, clear, and versatile, and as such has formed a cornerstone of historical game studies. However, this dichotomy between realist and conceptual is inherently limited and omits much nuance around the ways in which digital games engage with history. Chapman himself emphasized that even the most extremely conceptual game must have some realist components and vice versa, but this hasn't stopped his model from being used acritically by many subsequent scholars. This brings us to the point of this paper. Individual games, and in some cases whole genres, exist outside Chapman's dichotomy. Today I'm going to make 2 points. Firstly, games can engage with history empathetically, in a distinct manner from the realist and conceptual approaches discussed by Chapman. And secondly, role-playing games are particularly well suited to engage with history in this empathetic manner. In broad terms, empathetic approaches to history consider the perspective of the inhabitants of a historical period, or the participants in a historical event. Historical empathy is nothing new. There is a small but developed subfield which focuses on this approach, but attempting to understand personal and collective motivations behind the actions taken by historical figures is an intrinsic part of all but the most reconstructionist or structuralist approaches to history. Understanding the cultural and personal mindset of past populations is an important and valid field of study in and of itself, but is also vital in fully comprehending varied subfields of history. Implicitly or explicitly, this empathetic approach forms the core of much historical research and teaching. A number of scholars, such as Hartman, Tulloch, and Young, have highlighted the potential of games such as Valiant Hearts to engage players in a similar manner, through their construction of empathetic dialogue and play, often with strict avoidance of violence, and typically placing the player in roles where they have very limited power. Players are shown historical perspectives, the First World War in the case of Valiant Hearts, which they would not typically experience in realist or conceptual games. In Valiant Hearts, players experience long stretches of boredom between brief moments of terror in combat. They experience the war as a non-combatant, and they get drawn into non-violent and empathetic engagements with figures on the other side of the conflict. We can find similar elements within Papers, Please, where the player acts as a Cold War border guard, through The Darkest of Times, where you play as a member of the resistance movement in Nazi Germany, and Gloria Victis, where you lead a group of civilians within a besieged medieval city. These empathetic games undoubtedly overlap with realist and conceptual simulations to some extent. Valiant Hearts often incorporates realist elements in its audio-visual representations of the trenches of the First World War. Gloria Victis, Siege Survival, incorporates some conceptual approaches through its mechanics. But these are not the primary means by which they interact with history. Players are encouraged to engage with history through their lived experiences, rather than through graphical fidelity or procedural rhetoric. The empathetic approach taken by these games is therefore distinct from both the realist and conceptual engagements with history described by Chapman. These empathetic games exist outside the dichotomy. While historical empathy may be encouraged through a substantial range of games, role-playing games present a particular opportunity to engage with history through empathetic means. Role-playing games encourage players to identify with their character through the customization of their avatar and the ability to make meaningful decisions on the basis of their personal morals and attitudes. The assignment of particular roles or characteristics to players' avatars has been demonstrated to fundamentally alter their players' behavior. Players act differently when cast as a hero than as a villain. They behave differently as a law enforcer than a rogue. The depth of the worlds and lore of many role-playing games helps deepen players' immersion and empathy, especially when an understanding of this lore becomes important to succeed within the game. Likewise, the morality systems common to these games present a tangible mechanical account of the social mores of their settings. In short, by taking on the role of a historical or pseudo-historical character within a sufficiently detailed world, players are intrinsically encouraged to act in a manner befitting that character. In doing so, they are given an impression of the motivations, attitudes, and goals of that character and their world. In effect, the player engages in historical empathy through play. It is important to note that many games which would not typically be included within the role-playing genre nevertheless incorporate prominent empathetic role-playing elements. Assassin's Creed Valhalla, for example, clearly qualifies as a realist simulation under Chapman's description, but includes a number of role-playing elements, including quite substantial lore, several meaningful decisions, and some emphasis on interpersonal relationships. Role-playing elements in conceptual simulations are perhaps less common, but can be found. Crusader Kings 3 is one of the clearest examples of this trend. The game incorporates substantial role-playing elements through a focus on individual characters and interpersonal relationships. Unlike the abstract rulership of most conceptual games, players of Crusader Kings take on the role of an actual ruler with personal needs and ambitions. Ultimately then, I think we as history and heritage professionals have made a major oversight by sidelining historical role-playing games and marginalizing empathetic approaches to history and games more generally. These elements can have an important impact on their players' engagement with history. This is a particular issue with regards to the Middle Ages, which forms the setting for the vast majority of historical role-playing games. This in turn highlights an important issue within historical game studies. We need to do more to get to grips with the different tendencies in ludic historical representations of different periods. The clustering of different genres in particular periods heavily influences the way historical games represent these periods. This is compounded by the tropes associated with these different periods. As a result, there's no reason to expect that generalizations about games set in the 20th century would hold true for those set in the ancient or medieval world, or even in the 18th or 19th centuries. We need to consider these differences between periods more carefully. There are a number of difficulties inherent to studying empathetic games, and these reflect a broader issue for game studies. Analyzing audio-visual game worlds and the game rules and mechanics of conceptual games is relatively straightforward and can rely on many of the same approaches used when studying other historical media or constructing traditional historical arguments. Studying play, how players actually interact with a game, requires very different approaches, including surveys, interviews, and so forth. These tend to be more time-consuming, require more resources, and often fall outside the skill set of the typical historian. This is a particular issue for role-playing games with their particular emphasis on player interaction. Role-playing isn't the only significant absence from Chapman's dichotomy, although I maintain it's the most important. Fantasy and other supernatural settings, including mythological approaches, can be hugely influential on their players' historical understandings, but take a less direct and more abstract approach which carry their own sets of traditions and assumptions. Hardcore games, including Souls-likes, roguelikes, and survival games, use their punishing mechanics in a very different manner from conceptual games, but these can nevertheless strongly influence their players' historical thinking. More generally, the presence of role-playing and other empathetic historical games highlights limitations of systems of classification. I need to emphasize again that Chapman's spectrum is incredibly useful and versatile and remains my go-to for classifying historical games. But as Chapman has noted when he posited the model, it has notable limitations and was never intended to be universal. Treating the realist conceptual dichotomy as gospel in every situation is an unsatisfactory approach. To wrap up then, there are a lot of caveats, but while we should absolutely continue to make use of Chapman's approach, we need to make sure we treat it as intended, as a guide rather than an absolute. Role-playing games are just one example of historical games which are neither realist nor conceptual. There's a large and growing range of literature addressing all of these issues, including Chapman's work most importantly, and this is visible through a huge range of games. Thank you all very much for listening, and I look forward to any questions. Cheers.